Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to highlight several features from Chapter 11 from the textbook, which focuses on Rollo May. First up, we'll talk about Rollo May's life and how some of the things that happened to him in his past helped to influence what he went on to study, research, and write about in his career. We'll talk about existentialism, and then this unique branch of psychology, existential psychology, and certainly as it relates to traits and characteristics. The chapter focuses on a case study of a man named Philip. And so the chapter opens with a bit about Philip's life and then returns to his story at several other points to highlight some of the concepts from Rollo May's existentialist view of psychology and personality. So we'll talk around that, but I'll let the chapter and the textbook focus more so there rather than this lecture focusing on that. But we will mention it. We'll talk about anxiety, and in particular, neurotic anxiety, and also guilt, and how those two emotions, anxiety and guilt, do have a defining ontological effect on our lived experiences. We'll highlight intentionality, the differences among care and love and will. And some related research. First up, Biography of Rollo May. He was born in Ohio, so he is another American-born researcher and psychologist that we're focusing on this semester. He, in theory, was born to meager means or more humble beginning, but what we know of America's history is that as a white male, even though this was a poor time in our country's history, we were coming in and out of international conflicts, and this was around the time that we were entering and headed toward the Great Depression. But as a white male, he did have a place of privilege and of influence in the United States. And so that certainly helps to frame some of his views on care and authenticity and will. But more about that in a moment. So born in Ohio in the early 20th century, college educated, was well-to-do enough to be able to travel to Europe, and then traveled around Europe for several years as an artist, as people say, finding himself. So he had the luxury of time and other resources to spend years of his life traveling around Europe, finding himself in and out of study for art, but also meeting some very influential psychologists and other researchers, and able to network and share his thoughts and be heard on an international level. Returned to the United States, graduated with theology degree, and that also helps to understand why he had such an emphasis on being agentic and having an authentic, purpose-filled, and driven life. He had this eye toward living a fulfilled, if you will, elevated, in touch, and in tune, harmonious life, with the spirit and drive. So after he finished at seminary or theological school, he did work in that field for 2 years as a pastor, but then he quit because he wanted to focus more so on the psychology and people's thoughts and feelings and emotions and typical patterns of behavior and how he could influence those and research and focus on those more in a more devoted way. He went on to receive his PhD, excuse me, at the age of 40, which is awesome. So again, imagine a person who has had two careers really, traveled around as an artist and then went to theological school and then worked as a pastor. Imagine a person giving up both of those and going on to get a PhD at the age of 40. A lot of people kind of want to be settled by then. So the type of person who has enough resources and money and time and respect of people just in general could certainly explore the luxury of giving up focused, devoted 9 to 5 type work and go and get a doctorate to start a new chapter in his life. Published The Meaning of Anxiety in 1950 and did a lot of work focusing on how anxiety and guilt and other emotions do serve as a catalyst in our lives. He worked at a number of schools, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth, and the like, a lot of big name Ivy League schools. Unfortunately, he did have serious illnesses that he struggled with for many years of his life. And being very ill and having to devote so much of his time and energy and resources to trying to get better, you can imagine how that also led him down a path of exploration and being able to think critically and analytically about his own experience and how it related to the experience of others in his and similar cases. So that also influenced what he went on to write about and how he chose to write about it. But he died in California in 1994. And he's still known as the existential psychology guy, right, for America. So he is the focus of this chapter. An overview of existential psychology, believed to be rooted in European existential philosophy and can certainly be traced back to people like Nietzsche and others who are cited in your textbook. It is based on clinical experience, not so much thousands upon thousands of people's data, but rather his personal experience and reflections on the cases of people with whom he worked and also himself, or what May wrote about was based there. A central tenet: people live in the present and are responsible for their experiences. So it's really important to focus on the cultural contextualization of this work. This work is not written from the perspective of the downtrodden and the disenfranchised. This work is written from the perspective of people who have power, who already have freedom of will, and who already have all the rights and privileges and protections under the law, such that they can focus on being agentic. And they can focus on having essential freedom and existential freedom because the law and society affords that to them. So that's really important to point out. So other key tenets of existential psychology, this notion that people sometimes they lack courage to face their own destinies. And so they flee from it. So they have the right and they have the resources to achieve their potential and achieve their goals and to face their destinies, but they can shy away from it or run away from it literally and give up their freedom. Of course, they can go back and get it at any point because they have that ability, but they certainly have this free choice and free will and can run away from their destiny. And in the process, they can give up their freedom. They don't take responsibility. That was That's another key tenet, this notion that people have responsibility for their own success and for their failure, and they need to live up to it and own up to it. And then the last point, healthy people challenge destiny and live authentically. They are present in the moment. They are authentic, agentic beings, and they take responsibility for fully living their lives to the fullest. Here is a YouTube video that I have found that highlights footage of Rollo May from a fairly famous interview that he gave many years ago at this point. As you know, he passed in 1994. But I encourage you to watch the video and then answer the questions on this slide and the next one. And naturally, you probably want to pause the video so you can note the YouTube link and also note the questions. And I think going through that exercise will be very helpful to you in terms of developing a deeper understanding of some of Rollo May's key tenets and how they relate to some of the material in your text and our lived experiences just in general. And there's the second half of those 8 questions. Okay, so what are some of the key points of existentialism? Let's delve more deeply. One is the notion that existence takes precedence over essence, meaning our lived experience and our engagement with that, the processes, or the act of living is way more important than just being in the world or our status, our titles, etc. The experience of living is way more important than those more static markers that we are alive. So existence takes precedence over essence. And human beings are both subjects and objects, right? So they're subjects in the sense that they are these effortful, agentic beings that act upon the environment and that cause things to happen and can chart their courses and set their destinies and make their own decisions. But we're also objects in the sense that we are acted upon by our environments, both social and physical. And so we're both these agentic beings acting upon the environment, but we're also these objective beings that are acted upon by the environment, and really have to see human beings as both, to have as much of an authentic view of them and their lived experiences and why they do what they do. So there should not be a split between the subject and the object, and intentionality really helps to bridge that gap, which we'll get to in several slides. The third point, people search for some meaning to their lives. We are not just in the world being acted upon. It is human nature to want to understand what's going on and why and how long and for what purpose. So people do search for some meaning to their lives. That's a human nature. And each of us is responsible for who we are and what we become. So while there are, objectively speaking, some things that happen to us and that influence everybody, for all intents and purposes, the same way, we are the captains of our fate and the masters of our souls. And so we are ultimately responsible, not our parents, not society, not the law, but us. So a key point at the bottom there is that this approach to viewing humans and their lived experiences is very anti-theoretical, and it is very classist. It's Eurocentrist. It's very biased. Again, as I was alluding to earlier, against the downtrodden and the disenfranchised. It really doesn't take into account the limits and the reductions that in some ways society uh, explicitly and implicitly imposes on their lives. So it's very biased, but it does do a good job of helping to explain and understand the experience of certain people in our culture and society. And a couple more basic concepts: being in the world versus non-being. And similar to some of the other theorists we've studied this semester, Rollo May proposed conflict is a very key part of human experience. And so there is this war, if you will, that goes on between our innate desire to be in the world and to have vitality and life and goals and success and will and willpower, and non-being in the world. And while there are many different definitions of non-being in the world, it, you could say, is at the other end of the balance or the dimension, if you will, of being in the world. And so those two are conflicting, theoretically speaking, and war with one another to help influence our personalities and characteristics, our state of being in the world and also non-being. Those are related concepts. And this is figure 11.1 from the textbook. And it highlights three other points from May's writings. And these points are an Eigenwelt, Umwelt, and Mitwelt. And there are three simultaneous modes of ways people can be in the world, if you will. So Eigenwelt refers to our relationship with ourselves. So how well do you know yourself? Do you understand yourself, your desires, your goals? How do you feel about yourself? How well are you working toward that? Are you in tune with it and supportive of it and making decisions that help you, stay in connection and stay in sync with yourself and your desires and in a positive way? Then the Umwelt, that refers to the environment around us and how well are we in touch with, aware of, understanding with regard to our more so physical environment, but it could also be a social and cultural environment as well. And then the Mitwelt, that refers to basically our existence in relation to other people. So this is one that focuses on the social world and our relationships and experiences with regard to other people and what is going on in their lives and what they think and feel, etc. And so the notion here is that there are these three simultaneous ways that we exist in the world that are always going on, and at the center or the overlap of this Venn diagram, the darkest gray part in the middle there, that's us, right? So how we are existing in these three modes at all times, that's our more authentic reflection or representation of us and our lived experience. Yes, and it can be difficult to juggle all of those balls and be aware of all of those processes and laws and concepts and codes and expectations at the same time. But healthy, according to Rollo May, healthier people are able to be aware of all of those things and keep all of those balls juggling, so to speak, in the air and stay plugged into the situation. Now, it can be trying, and of course, healthy people can drop a ball every now and again. That doesn't mean that you're not healthy. It just means that life happens and you're able to ebb and flow, bob and weave with it. So normally we would experience some anxiety and some trepidations every now and again with regard to those things. And normal anxiety is just that. It's normal. It's an uneasiness or a dread that's proportionate to the situation. It doesn't involve repression or you trying to run from a situation or deal unhealthfully with the situation. It typically is confronted in a constructive, mature way on a conscious level. But neurotic anxiety is different from normal anxiety. Here, the dread or the uneasiness is disproportionate to the threat. It's an overreaction, if you will, or a very unhealthy reaction. And it does involve repression or some other diversion of that energy to another target, whether appropriate or not, socially acceptable or not. It does involve a diversion. And it's managed oftentimes by various kinds of blocking off of activity and awareness. So things like inappropriate relationships, drug usage, drinking, overeating, depression. Those are some of the ways in which unhealthy people, are dealing with their unhealthy neurotic anxiety. And you can imagine how dealing with the anxiety in those ways certainly diverts our energy from realizing our full potential, being the best that we can be, etc. So hopefully you're seeing throughout this chapter and your reading of the chapter and certainly some of the concepts that are being brought up in this presentation that Rollo May's lived experience certainly filtered into some of the things that he went on to study. And these things that he went on to study and write about certainly directly speak to personality traits and characteristics and typical patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving for people. Okay, so guilt is another emotion that Rollo May suggests has this ontological effect on people. And guilt arises when people do any one or more than one of the following: deny their potentialities, right? So if a person is in denial about living up to his or her own potential, that can bring about a guilty feeling. Also, if a person fails to accurately perceive the needs of others, and so if they know they're not living up to other people's expectations or not helping to bridge the gaps that other people have, if a person is in that situation, guilt can arise. And then third, if a person remains oblivious to their dependence on the natural world, so they're out of touch, with what's going on around them in that culture, in that society, that can bring about guilt too. And there are 3 forms of the ontological guilt, also associated with the Umwelt, the Mitwelt, and the Eigenwelt. And you recall figure 11.1 highlights the Umwelt, the Eigenwelt, and the Mitwelt. So just to recap, I brought that slide back up. But there are 3 forms of the ontological guilt that map onto those 3 modes of being in the world. And guilt can be authentic, normal, healthy, if you will, because it can help us develop a healthy sense of humility. If it's not an overreaction or an undue reaction to the situation, if it's authentic, it can help us develop a healthy sense of humility, improve our relationships with other people. It can be the fire that keeps us going in the right direction, to keep us hungry for the types of relationships we should be having, mature, healthy relationships. And also, it can help us creatively use our potentialities. It can help us stay hungry, stay driven, stay grounded, if you will. But neurotic guilt, much like neurotic anxiety can be perverted, and it can lead us even further down the avenue of unhealthfulness, just like neurotic anxiety. So it can lead us to non-productive or neurotic symptoms such as depression, cruelty, chronic indecisiveness, those types of things. Intentionality. This is a concept and a way of being that can help bridge the gap between the subject and object views of people and perspectives of people. It's a structure that gives meaning to experience and allows people to make decisions about their future. And so other terms that you may have heard used to reference intentionality are things like being present in the moment, being agentic, being authentic and driven. Those are synonymous with Rollo May's notion of intentionality. So it bridges the gap between ourselves as subjects and ourselves as objects, because the intentions are functions of both of these, right? So if you're present in the moment, you're not just aware of what you want to do and what goals you have. You're also aware of what's going on around you, socially speaking and physically speaking, and what goals and intentions other people may have, that involve you or that may not involve you. And so when you're intentional and present in the moment and agentic and plugged into the process, you're able to weigh all of those things at the same time and still keep, as people say, the main thing. Remain intentional, keep your goals prominent, and keep pushing. Now, it can be conscious, but it can also be unconscious, right? So if you're meditating on your goals and what potential you're trying to achieve and realize, that certainly is gonna, as some people say, it's gonna come out your pores. It'll be evident in what you say and are readily, explicitly aware of, but it'll also filter out into the things that you do and that you may be doing and expressing unconsciously as well. Okay, that brings us to the three concepts: care and love and will. And so Rollo May does differentiate among these three. Care is the more basic, and out of it certainly can come love and will. And he writes about three forms of love, and he differentiates love from sex. And he talked about, and I think you can hear part of that in that clip I alluded to earlier, but he often discussed how sex had become so perverted by our culture that it was seen as a compulsive, emotionless obsession rather than perhaps what it was intended to be, and certainly what it could be at its most beautiful. And then he differentiated among several forms of love: eros or erotic types of love, philia types of love, and also agape. And I've defined those three there, and of course you can read more about them. I'm trying to stay cognizant of this time. This one is going to be a little bit longer, unintentionally though. There was just a lot of good information in this chapter focusing on Rollo May. Freedom and destiny. And as I alluded to, no, I didn't allude, I explicitly stated earlier, Rollo May's concepts and writings are classist in their orientation. And it's important to say that, excuse me, not to be nitpicky or slick, but to be authentic, right? To have an honest look, to take an honest look at who he was and how to best interpret his work and how to best apply and extend his work. And so he wrote a lot about freedom and running away from one's authenticity and autonomy is a choice. Everybody doesn't have autonomy. Everybody is not allowed to be their authentic selves. Everybody does not have complete freedom and protection under the law and in society. And so, while again, some of the concepts that he wrote about, like for example, with regard to freedom and destiny, do apply to some people in our culture and society, they do not apply to all people in our culture and society. So freedom differs depending upon who you're talking about. So freedom is defined in the chapter, and I'll let you read over that. But I did want to give that disclaimer because it is important to talk about the role of culture and to talk about the role of multiple identities and intersectionality in this work that we're reading about. And so wrote about two forms of freedom: existential freedom and also essential freedom, and how sometimes those two freedoms can lead us to do things that are divisive and in some ways self-harming. And so sometimes there are behaviors that help you celebrate and fully express and experience essential freedom, but that push against or kind of fly in the face of existential freedom. And so I'll let you ponder over that and read over that. And certainly if you have any questions, let me know. Again, I got my eye on the time. And then going back to the case of Philip. Poor Philip, the chapter began with a brief summary story about him and his relationships with women, partly his childhood, and then an adult relationship, which is the focal point of the vignette there. And so hopefully you'll read through that and explore some of the questions that are posed, such as, what is destiny? What do you perceive Philip's destiny to be? And why do you think he was going about it in such a passive, inauthentic, unintentional way? Like, where do you think his approach had its origins? How do you think that unintentionality was manifesting itself? What are some of the examples? And then what recommendations would you have as a therapist working with somebody like Philip? What recommendations would you have for him to move from this more passive way of living to a more intentional, free way of living that's more enjoyable? The Power of Myth. Rollo May wrote extensively about myths and how important those are to our culture and our society, especially as our culture becomes more hedonistic, if you will, as our culture becomes more hedonistic, if you will. So I encourage you to read more about that and rationalistic language versus myths, how those two are different and why they are important in terms of interpreting key factors with regard to a given culture. I think many of the things that Rollo May wrote about are so poignant and relevant when you think about our global warming crisis and our crises with regard to recycling and, as people say, recycling, reducing, and reusing, and how that influences the physical environment. And so some of his points about apathy and emptiness are the malaise of modern times are so, I think, timely. Like, we've gotten so far removed from the earth, and the act of growing food and preparing food and eating food, for many of us, it's so fragmented when it shouldn't be. Say 100 years ago, it was not as fragmented as it is today. And because it's so fragmented today, we are out of touch. And that does result in anxiety. It results in guilt, apathy, and malaise. And hopefully those are some of the points that jumped out at you as you read the chapter. But if you have any questions, let me know. You're always welcome to and encouraged to do that. I'm trying to keep it shorter. Okay, so people have become alienated from the natural world and from other people and also from ourselves. And that brings about a host of negative outcomes, higher rates of in addition to the anxiety and the guilt and the apathy and the malaise that I was just talking about, certainly higher rates of depression and unhealthy, maladaptive behaviors, addictions, drug use, those types of things. The symptoms can be temporary, but they can also be permanent. So one way to combat those is to plug back in and to stop being so far removed and fragmented from the physical world and the social world and from ourselves, and to get back in touch. Some of the goals of May's psychotherapy are highlighted on this slide, and you can read more about that and in your chapter. And certainly in that video that I provided the link to, you can hear him talk about, in his own words, his own work, which I think is pretty awesome. So those, again, are some of the key factors of Rollo May's version of psychotherapy. And some related research. In one of my classes this semester, we focus on terror management theory. And I have an exercise that highlights terror management theory that I think is a great exercise. And if you're so inclined, I'm happy to send it to you or post it for you so that you can work through it. But you can certainly read about terror management theory and how it has its origins in this existential psychology as it relates to personality and characteristics. You can read more about that in your chapter as well. So, I apologize for this being a longer video than I had intended, but recapping, we did talk a bit about the biography of Reverend Dr. Rollo May, and we talked a bit about existentialism and existential psychology, a little bit about the case of Philip and how you can apply some of Rollo May's concepts to Philip's life in order to better understand how he got to where he is and how he can get from where he is to healthier. A little bit about anxiety and guilt, as well as intentionality, care, love, and will. Freedom and how it relates to destiny. Why Americans in particular are so preoccupied with myths and the functions that they serve. Psychopathology, psychotherapy, and a little bit about related research. I hope this lecture has been helpful to you. As is always the case, if you have questions, feel free to email me at dcothrn@alasu.edu, and I'm happy to, if I can't answer your question via email, happy to set up an appointment where we can talk it out, either face-to-face or on Zoom or FaceTime or something like that. Thanks, everybody.